So before I deep dive, I would like to wrap up again basically what new set of rights the new RED Plus directive gives, so that we're all on the same page. So the new Renewable Energy Directive is already a turning point for energy communities, because for the first time they're legally mentioned in European legislation, and they could rely on EU support. Before that moment, they only relied in particularly on national support schemes that were developed in different member states. But here, for the first time, we have an EU-wide framework that guarantees already the right of these communities. So in particular, the new RED Plus directive gives the right of European citizens, small businesses, local authorities, and cooperatives to produce, consume, store, and sell their own renewable energy without being subject to discriminatory taxes and excessive bureaucracy. And these activities could be done either individually or collectively, already, for example, as independent legal entities. Also, member states are obliged to assess all the difficulties and barriers towards the execution of these rights. And this is very important for the transposition process, because based on these comprehensive assessments of the barriers for energy community, they need to design a new enabling framework and in national level how to remove these barriers. So they also have the right not to be unfairly charged for the energy they produce themselves. Also the right to access all energy markets, either directly or through a third party. They also have protection against discriminatory procedures, and also the right to access certain supporting schemes or remuneration for engaging in renewable productions. Also very new, and something which has not been fully transposed in many member states, is a right to engage in peer-to-peer energy trading and energy sharing. And also they have the right to access to this information, and which would allow them to know basically how to exercise this right. However, in order for these rights to become effective, they need to be transposed into national legislation, which many member states have already started, and some of them have already transposed, others are lagging behind. However, member states have certain discretionary power into how they are going to implement these changes, and particularly the legal forms of renewable energy communities. I will come to this later. So based on our pilot countries, I'm not sure, are you seeing my screen? Because I also see all these windows are opening up. I hope everyone is seeing already the graph.
Yes.
Okay, so because I see on the downwards. So basically, this is an overview of the different legal conditions we have in the 3 pilot countries, Germany, Italy, and the Czech Republic. And these are also some of the challenges towards implementing also the RED Plus directive, because some of the challenges are already rooted into the national legal systems. And in particularly, like what we see, and this has been discussed, so I quickly will share a very comparative overview of different legal frameworks and incentives. As we already mentioned, in Germany, there is a shift from feed-in tariffs to auctions for the electricity system. So this kind of feed-in tariff payments will be eventually phased out, and in particularly renewable energies or renewable energy support schemes and all conditionalities are already defined in the Erneuerbare Energiegesetz, or the German Renewable Energy Sources Act. And particularly their market premium schemes, which are depend on the tendering procedure, and special schemes for electricity intensive enterprises and for self-consumption. Very interesting is that there is already a low interest loans, and which supports the usage of stationary battery storage system related to a PV installation. However, in one of the new legislation, there has been already a so-called auctioning scheme. The German government decided to raise the amount of auctioning for PV, in particular for PV installations and for onshore wind. Very interesting is also there will be changes to the so-called tenant electricity surcharge, or tenant electricity arrangement, Up till now, what is interesting is that household owners, they could profit from feed-in tariffs under this tenant electricity arrangement. However, the ones that were living in shared flats, the tenants living in shared flats, in many cases did not have the incentives to install PV and let already the tenant use it. However, under the current legislation, there will be alleviation, and for example, there will be alleviation in terms of some of the commercial taxes will not be paid. In Italy, in particular, we have a particular system that the support schemes are already decided by a management authority, which manages the electricity services. And so the major support schemes are related to reduction in VAT, real estate tax. However, power plants can also opt for net metering, scambio sul posto. So for the renewable energy heating, the support is based on a price-based mechanism. For biofuels, there are certain quota system that is already applied. And for the Czech Republic, there are very limited support schemes. And in particular, there is exemption from real estate, and we have the guarantee and feed-in tariff or fixed premium tariff on the top of the market price. And power plants can choose one of the both option. Operators of hydropower plant, they can also benefit under one of the operational programs, which is the one for competitiveness and innovation. And PV installations are already receiving subsidies under the environment program. Here, one major obstacle, as I mentioned before, even if there are certain schemes or investment loans for refurbishment, domestic refurbishment of buildings, many consumers or prosumers are not applying for it because they need to cover, it's not a downward payment, they need to cover this upfront costs from themselves, which is a particular obstacle for energy poor households. Here is once again the overview of the existing incentives and measures in different countries. This is for the energy efficiency, renewable energy management optimizations. And it's also based on the different energy domain. So what are currently some of the major challenges that we identified at national level? And particularly, these are the constant change of policies and retroactive changes in many of the countries. For example, in the Czech legislation in 2014, there have been a withdrawal of support for solar PV and wind projects, and that led to decline or delaying of the energy transition there. Another major challenge is already related to that also, the transposition process is very uneven. There are countries like Germany, France, Slovenia that have already started the process, and in Italy, like many of these provisions are partially implemented, but other countries like Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, they're already lagging behind in this. The access to information is already a key challenge, because in many cases, first of all, with these frequent changes in national legislation, this makes always the investors and households consume. So also the information is scattered very much between different institutions, different ministries. So there is not one database where an investor, a household, an SME can find all the information required with all the information regarding the permit, the regulatory framework. There is not a coherent information about the incentives also, which is currently impeding this lack of information. So there is also a lot to improve in that aspect. I think we already addressed the access to finance, which many of these renewable energy communities are encountering, and in particular these upfront costs that they have to pay. I think one of the presenters pointed also to the welfare dilemma, and that basically getting off the grid and becoming self-sufficient in many of the countries could be a privilege only for more well-off citizens. So getting off the grid, so the rest of the costs have to be carried disproportionately by the other consumers, and particularly the energy poor consumers, which is creating this welfare dilemma. Another thing that I mentioned, in many countries, and particularly in Bulgaria, there are no targeted, tailored mechanisms, in particular for small-scale investments, like microcredits, microloans, as we already discussed. For example, in the European investment banks, the schemes are designed in such a way that the threshold is too high. So this type of small-scale projects are not particularly supported. So this is something to be improved, and in particular the information about these different financing mechanisms, and also this is also a result in some countries as a result of conservative banking policies and lack of awareness of financial institutions on adopting such tailored financial schemes. Quite an important challenge is access to the grid and the discriminatory grid regulations in many of the countries, and we have already seen this with currently with our pilot countries in many countries like Bulgaria and already Czech Republic. And in general, access to the public grid in general is quite important for renewable energy communities, because they need already to sell part of their surplus to the grid in order to become sustainable. And in some cases, grid connection is already denied due to technical reasons or delayed. And there are no justification for this, and also in some cases no possibility to contest this in a court issue. So basically, with the transposition of the RED Plus directive, a major issues that national policymakers should address is how to adjust this kind of grid regulations for small-scale renewable energy producers, so that they're not penalized by this process, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are some best practices in Austria and France with local grid tariffs that are implemented, in particular for this purpose. Another particular challenge at national level is that being an owner or co-owning an asset in a renewable energy cooperative or a CSOP model in some cases creates problems for vulnerable consumers in many countries with their national social regulations. For example, energy poor household or individual that are receiving social benefits. At the same time, they cannot be an owner of an asset in a renewable energy cooperatives, or they cannot no longer receive their social benefits if somehow they're engaged in this activity. So this is another inconsistency that needs to be removed in particular, that social policies need to be also made fit also with the empowering of vulnerable consumers to be able to participate in the energy transition. Going back,
could you wrap up and
yes. Another thing is also the EU-wide challenges we already encounter. We already know that many of the market access rules and network grid regulations, they favor large centralized utilities, and national loopholes are used by large incumbents in order to prevent the entry of these new players on the market. And this is especially true for Central and Eastern Europe, where the power of the markets is in the hands of oligopolies. So decentralization is often prevented. So we have an equal access to ancillary services and capital, and also capacity markets that needs to be removed. And also many of these availability requirements, access requirements are also in a kind of shaped by these dominant actors. Another wide challenge is also the legal forms of the renewable energy cooperatives. During the transposition process, it's very important how these are defined in national legislation. The feedback that we receive during interviews in many countries is that the legal definition in some countries does not correspond to the true spirit of renewable energy communities that are non-profit collective enterprises of citizens that are voluntary collected and already they're fulfilling these wider social and environmental goals. And particularly in some countries like Italy, for example, this legislation, the way these provisions are implemented. They differentiate between self-consuming, so self-consumers and renewable energy communities, and this self-consuming element is not highlighted well enough within the renewable energy community. So, and in many countries, we have a definition of this technical and economic characteristic, but not so much of the legal standing of the renewable energy communities. The other thing is already the technical challenge, which is related to balancing geographically dispersed intermittent renewable energy with demand. Here we need to address complementarity already into this process, and the transaction costs, which are already related to integrating small, medium-sized, a lot of small, medium-sized actors, and also how to govern this process. I cannot click on the, okay. So what are the recommendations to both national policymakers and to EU institutions? So first of all, the focus of renewable energy policies has to be expanded not only to electricity, but to heating and cooling, with the proper incentives to the end users also in this sector. Complementarity, addressing complementarity among a range of actors could also solve the issue of intermittency. And specific, and also based on this, also the proximity concept has to be specified. I'll go to it later. We already need to adopt specific measures to promote the role of energy communities also in the implementation of energy efficiency policies and provisions according to Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive. Community-based criteria have to be included also in the public procurement of energy services or in the tenders. We need also targeted support measures, as I said, and what could be a solution with latecomers, with countries like Bulgaria, is a national action plan for jump-starting investment could be designed with initial pilot phase that could be tested in several municipalities and then followed up by a nationwide program. Sorry, I somehow missed the last point. So at an EU level, in terms of the transposition of the directive, various categories have to be defined based on proximity, and the proximity has to be based on spatial recognition and local needs. We need to avoid too narrow definition of proximity, because sometimes we have more large-scale wind projects that involve the participation beyond one municipality. Business models like CSOP, which are enabling partnership with commercial investors, need to be promoted, while at the same time incumbent control has to be limited. One very important thing also in Italy is there were some, within the transposition of the RED Plus directive, there were some renewable energy communities that they were receiving, they could self-consume and they also receive some discount on the utility bills, but in some cases the grid is still in the ownership of these majority investors. So we need to prevent this incumbent control or capturing the energy cooperatives or energy communities in some cases. Also, we should try to use as much as possible the European cohesion policy funding, and also in some cases the recovery plan, to support mechanisms for citizen-led projects. And particularly in the recovery plan, there is a lot of focus on large-scale infrastructural projects, but not so much on decentralized citizen initiative. In particular, in terms of cohesion policy funding, interesting is Article 25 of these regulations on the funds, which talks about community-led initiatives and how we can support them. We need also a framework for vulnerable households in the transposition, and energy poverty should be already prioritized in the frameworks of the energy and environmental ministries. Sorry that I took longer, and so thank you very much for your attention.